Welcome, everyone, to our event hosted by the Center for African and African American Studies. We thank you for taking time to be here, and I will first introduce our speaker for today. His name is Dr. Derek Avery. He is the C.T. Bauer Chair of Inclusive Leadership at the University of Houston's Bauer College of Business. Derek earned his BS in psychology with a minor in sociology from Tulane University in New Orleans and his master's and PhD in industrial and organizational psychology here at Rice University, where his dissertation research focused on the role of race in organizational choice. His primary research interests include workforce diversity, diversity climate, and employee input mechanisms. He has over 100 publications, including at least 70 peer-reviewed article publications. He is an elected fellow with the Association for Psychological Science and also the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. He also is actively engaged in service as the current Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology Diversity and Inclusion Officer and has served on editorial boards of numerous top-tier journals. In 2019, Dr. Avery was recognized as the Academy of Management International Human Resource Management Scholarly Research Award recipient. And in 2020, he received an honor, which I know is one of the things he's most proud of, as the Janet Chusmeer Distinguished Service Award recipient, which is presented to nominees who have made an outstanding contribution to the Gender and Diversity Division of the Academy of Management, as personally serving as mentors and role models for others in the field, including myself. Today, his talk is titled Black in Business, What the Evidence Tells Us About Being a Black Employee. So we will have Derek discuss that topic with us, and then I ask that you all put your questions in the comment section. And then at the end of Derek's talk, Dr. Jacqueline Kuti will moderate a question and answer session with Derek. And with that, we thank you, Derek, so much for being here, and I ask you all to join me in welcoming Derek Avery.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Danielle. I appreciate it, and it is always great to be amongst owls. Let me share my screen here so that we can have some visual aids just to kind of organize things as we progress through. Now I gotta move the controls so that I can get my slideshow. Gotta love technology. There we go. So as Danielle mentioned, the title for my talk today is Black in Business, What the Evidence Tells Us About Being a Black Employee. And I want to begin with an overview, just so that everyone has a sense as to where it is that I'm hoping to go with this conversation today. And the first thing I want to do is talk about what I consider an inconvenient truth about systemic racism in organizations. We have, within the last year, all of a sudden been inundated by conversation about racism, both in society at large, as well as in organizational settings. And I feel like there is sort of a starting point for a talk like this that needs to address the elephant in the room. And so we will do that by talking about this inconvenient truth about systemic racism. From there, we will move on into a conversation about the evidence. So we'll start with what the evidence tells us about trying to get in the door, right? So the prospect of being recruited or being selected for a position. We'll talk about what the recent evidence tells us about the role of race in those processes. From there, we will transition to talking about what happens after you are in the workforce and find yourself there as a Black employee. What do we know from the state of the science is unique about the Black experience in organizational settings? From there, we'll move into a transition. I am a lifelong optimist and hate giving talks about negative things. And so, one of the things that I always try and do is temper these conversations, because we're going to discuss a lot of stuff that doesn't make you feel great, right? We're going to discuss a lot of things that are real and therefore worthy of discussion, but they do not necessarily leave one with a positive taste in one's mouth. So we will then also discuss things in the recent literature, things in the recent research findings that give us some cause for encouragement. And finally, I'll move to a quick wrap up where I try to make sense of it all before we move into the question and answer session. So with that as a backdrop, let's talk about this elephant in the room. What is this inconvenient truth to which I'm referring? I want to start with a movie quote. So this was a quote from one of my favorite movies, The Usual Suspects. And this quote is originally attributed to a French poet. And the quote goes, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist." Now, I am not about to go Louis Farrakhan and make some, equivalency of, the devil and systemic racism. But I do think that we would all admit that systemic racism is an evil, right? Those of us who are people of faith tend to attribute evil to the devil. And so I think that there is a nice tie-in here, because one of the things that allows all of the things that are collectively make up this process of systemic racism is that people don't necessarily see the whole, right? You can get people to see one of the parts, but you don't necessarily ever see the whole. You can see a tree, but you don't see the forest. And so it's really, really easy to be dismissive of the existence of systemic racism because you don't necessarily ever see the entire thing. Now, one of the tenets of modern racism is this belief that racism is a thing of the past. And we see this manifested in a number of forms. We hear people say things every day that suggest this belief that, oh, it's not that bad anymore. Oh, this is something that, used to be really, really bad. My grandparents had to deal with this, but now it's fine, right? So you hear people talk about things like color blindness. Oh, I don't see color. Yes, you do. You may not admit that you see color, but you do. Or you, particularly in the wake of the election of President Barack Obama, you heard a lot of people started opining about whether or not we had moved to a post-racial society. Spoiler alert, we haven't. Now, for those of us who live in this skin, we know that our experience, both unique and shared with other people of color, oftentimes provides us with ample evidence that we're not in a post-racial society. People are not colorblind. People are still seeing the skin that we're in. It is still impacting the way in which they process things, the way in which they treat us, and as a result, our experience. But by and large, people don't want to hear that, right? So this talk isn't about that. It's not about me talking about my experience. It's about substantiating this quote that I took from Maxine Williams, who's the Chief Diversity Officer at Facebook. And I was at a conference where she said this, and I thought it was profound. Profound enough that Harvard Business Review eventually picked up on it. She said she works in the field of diversity, but has been Black her whole life. She says, so she knows underrepresented people are really yearning for these two things. The first is to hear that they're not crazy, right? And the second is to be offered institutional support. And that first piece is really, really important, right? Because that's the validation. So we know we have this wealth of practical life experience that is telling us, hey, everything is not on the up and up here. Something is wrong. But by and large, there's a lot of denial of that experience. And so the purpose of this talk is to discuss the state of the science, right? Because not only is experience telling us otherwise, but so is the science. So if we take a look at the first stage in the employee life cycle, the first stage is you got to get a job. And ideally, you want to get a good job. So the first part of getting a job is being recruited, right? And when we look at the literature out there on recruitment, whether it's general recruitment or targeted recruitment, one of the things that immediately jumps out at us is that a lot of organizations are just not checking for people of color in the same way that they are out there looking for white employees. And the Avery and McKay piece is really a canvassing of the literature where we look at all the recruitment literature and find quite succinctly that the way in which organizations tend to recruit is built upon models that were designed to attract primarily white and primarily male employees, right? So the recruitment processes are not really designed to expand beyond that part of the applicant pool. So it's not an accident that recruitment tends to yield applicant pools that are disproportionately overrepresented with respect to that group, right? This is who the mechanism has been built for. Then when we look at selection, as an IO psychologist, I've been trained about ways in which we can make selections so that it is universal, so that it is fair, so that it provides equal employment opportunity. But when we look at the literature, we see study after study after study that calls that into question. Right? So many of you have probably heard about the Bertrand and Mullin-Nathan study, which was one that gained a lot of popular press. And it asked the question, are Emily and Brendan more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? Right? And what they found through this audit study is that absolutely there is evidence of racial bias because you can send out otherwise equivalent resumes and you're going to get a lot more callbacks. You're going to see a lot more interest if your name suggests that you're white as opposed to if your name suggests that you're black. A more recent study found that this happens still, and it also happens within academia, right? So we are all connected to Rice in this academic setting. And in this particular study, they looked at people who were looking at getting into graduate school. And what they found is that faculty were much more responsive if the applicant was a white man than if the applicant was a non-white man, right? And they were judging this just off the basis of this name, right? It wasn't like they were going out and Googling or hiring a PI to tell them more information about these people. We also know from relatively recent research that there is a phenomenon known as resume whitening, whereby people of color will go in and scrub their resumes of information that will convey their identity to their prospective employers. And what they have found is that not only do people of color do this, but unfortunately it works. In that the more of that information you remove from your resume, the more appealing you tend to be to prospective employers. And what was perhaps even more unfortunate about that study is that they found that for organizations that put cues out there that suggested that people didn't need to do this because that organization really valued diversity, valuing diversity or espousing to value diversity didn't actually have the effect of undermining this whole process of resume whitening, right? And so through this ironic effect, what they found is that organizations that were saying that they valued diversity were actually ultimately being more discriminatory because people felt like, oh, I don't have to whiten my resume for this organization, only to realize, hey, you're not getting that callback now. Then unfortunately, even credentialing isn't foolproof. So I can remember growing up when my parents and my grandparents would tell me and my brother and my cousins that the way in which you defeat this racism out there against you is you work twice as hard, even if it will only get you half as far, right? But there was this notion that if you went to the right schools and you did the right things and you credentialed yourself in such a way, then your identity wouldn't be held against you in the same way. And what recent research suggests is that the payoffs for all of the things that you might invest in order to develop these credentials, those payoffs are disproportionate in that white people still benefit more from them, right? And so Gaddis looked at what is the impact of a college degree and what is the impact of a prestigious college degree. And what he found in his work is that Black folks who had a prestigious college degree were still seen as somewhat less attractive than white folks who didn't have a prestigious college degree, right? So even with this credentialing, still not leveling the playing field. Not to suggest you shouldn't want to go to a Rice or go to a Harvard or go to a Stanford, but just don't think that it's going to level the playing field. There's an old saying that, my credit just won't get it. And when my colleagues and I started to hear more and more rumblings from the EEOC about people who were raising concerns about the prospect of adverse impact involving employers using credit scores in selection, we did a simulation study in order to make this really, really clear. And what we found here is that utilizing credit histories in selection definitely is apt to create adverse impact because there's all this history that creates to racial and ethnic differences in credit scores that doesn't really have anything to do with how well someone is likely to perform on the job. But again, another potential warning sign out there, right? And then lastly, just at the stage of thinking about getting in the door, as I have these conversations with a number of folks who are in corporate, one of the things that I'm oftentimes asked is, well, but isn't it so much better now than it used to be? And of course it's better, but the question is how much better, right? And one of the things that this recent research has shown us is that if we look at where things have plateaued, there really hasn't been all that much change for the positive since the very beginning of my life, right? I was born in the mid-70s. There's a lot of organizational sociology research that shows that since the early 1980s, we really haven't seen a whole lot of progress in the workplace with with respect to the extent of discrimination in the hiring process. And that's pretty disappointing. It's also something that I would imagine that most folks would not know, but that is not me saying that, that's state of the science. So then in transitioning, what happens when I get there, right? I'm in the building, I'm working as an employee. Is it just that I have to overcome these hurdles in order to get myself into a job? And once I get myself into the job, now everything is going to be equivalent and I can compete with my peers who don't share this melanin? Well, unfortunately, no. Right? So one of the things that we find when we look at the literature is that there is this expectation that people will do more with less and will do more for less when it comes to employee compensation, right? So one of the findings there is that when we look at resource allocation, whether we're talking about a minority leader, a Black leader, or whether we're talking about a group that contains a higher percentage of Black individuals, the way in which resources tend to be allocated in organizational settings, there are fewer resources allocated to groups that are led by minorities, and there are fewer resources allocated to groups that are composed by a larger share of minorities, right? So there's this resource disparity just on the basis of the skin that you're in. Then when we start to look at things like individual compensation, one of the things that the literature has shown us relatively consistently is that the old saying, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, doesn't actually apply, right? So if we advocate to everybody to utilize the same strategies in order to try to maximize the compensation that you will receive in exchange for the efforts and the work that you provide, what we see is that it doesn't actually work that way. So this whole notion of jumping ship is what's known as an external labor market strategy. And that's when I go out and get other offers from other prospective employers and then use that to negotiate with my existing employer, my current employer, to try and get a raise. And what they found is that that strategy works really, really well if you're a white man. But if you're Black, not so much. In my own work with Morella Hernandez and some of our other colleagues, Cheryl Kaiser and Sabrina Volpone, we found that the way in which people respond to just simple negotiation differs depending upon whether you're Black and white, and people have much more negative responses when you negotiate if you're Black than if you're white, and that, of course, has adverse outcomes on the level of compensation that you receive, because if people think that you're being unfair in your expectations when you try to represent your own self-interest, they're less likely to capitulate to the demands that you might put forward in the process of this normal bargaining perspective known as negotiation. We also know that bias isn't just coming from employers. Bias is also coming from consumers and customers. The Banks et al. Study is a meta-analysis that looks at tipping, and what they find is that across the spectrum, customers tip less if their server is Black than if their server is white. And that's even after controlling for the level of service quality provided. The Heckman et al. Study takes a more all-encompassing look, so it takes it outside of the restaurant industry and finds a relatively similar thing, which is that customers, in terms of the ratings that they provide of their customer service interactions, tend to be much more penalizing, much harsher in the way in which they evaluate the performance that they received when that service provider is Black than if that service provider is white. In some other research that I have done with my colleague, Dr. Erica Hall, we found that through a process known as stigma by association, people who work with Black colleagues actually get paid less. Now, that process is not inevitable, but it's still one that doesn't make you feel real great, right? Because I would certainly like to reach out to people and say, hey, you should want to come work with me because I think that I'm good at my job, or because I think we could do some really cool stuff together, without having to provide the caveat, oh, and by the way, you're likely to get paid less because, you know, I'm Black. But ultimately, that relates to this old proverb, this old saying that, you know, is fairly common. We get judged by the company that we keep. And not only does this go for people who aren't Black being judged if they spend a significant amount of time or become associated with Black colleagues, but it also goes for Black folks, right? One of the findings that I found really disappointing, because there's all this work that suggests that when Black individuals work in settings where there are more Black people, we tend to be discriminated against less. But this particular study was looking at promotions, and what they found is that the prospect of receiving a promotion is actually inversely associated with the proportion of Black colleagues that a Black employee has, right? And so it really facilitates this whole crabs in the bucket mentality of thinking, right? I don't want to be surrounded by a bunch of Black colleagues because now I don't stand out as much anymore. And so it feeds into this whole notion of token dynamics that oftentimes prevents us from being as unified and from exhibiting as much solidarity in our approaches to equal employment opportunity, because we're trying to maximize our own personal outcomes. Now, you probably noticed that the theme recurring here. I am a pastor's son, so I do use, you know, a lot of, you know, biblical references here, but the no love for Moses is just referring to the fact that if you are a leader of Black people, you're actually evaluated less favorably than if you are a leader of white people, even if we control for everything else. Right? So there is no love for Moses here, right? There is no love for one who is leading the oppressed. It is another way in which people are judged by the company that they keep, and it is not based on anything objective or anything related to how well you're performing your job. There's also this really insidious literature out there on what they call serendipitous drift. And what this refers to is when we get placed in organizations, we might get placed in one place, but eventually what tends to happen over time is that likes tend to be clustered with likes. And so you end up with all of the women over here and all of the Black folks over here and all of the Hispanic folks over here. And what that ultimately does is it makes it really easy to provide greater access to employee opportunities to folks in this camp, but not folks in this camp. So it really helps to perpetuate any forms of systemic discrimination that are embedded in the system. There's also a ton of research out there showing all of the ways in which we are constrained by stereotypes. So people have these perceptions of what Black folks are like, and those stereotypes really, really constrain us in a number of different ways. Right? This Grandy et al. Paper was one that I did with my colleagues Alicia Grandy and Lawrence Houston, and I am oftentimes criticized by my students for not being emotionally expressive enough. You know, they write things in my comments that say, Dr. Avery needs to smile more. I couldn't tell what he was thinking at all times, and it made me uncomfortable, right? Things that my white colleagues look at and they go, I've never seen that in my, comments. But what we found in this study is that this whole notion of, emotional expression, or what we call surface acting, right? Where you're giving this, false positive, where you're exaggerating, hey, I'm happy to be here, right? That is required in order for Black folks to be seen on par with white folks in these customer service dimensions. Or in the Luke Shida et al. Paper, which was another paper with some of my colleagues, we found that when Black folks are late, it triggers this stereotypical association of Black folks with tardiness, and we get penalized in ways that white folks don't, even when they exhibit similar levels of tardiness. So, lots of negative there. Let's flip the switch and talk a little bit about positive. right? One of the things that has shown up in the literature recently that I find to be pretty encouraging is that being friends with Black folks has some benefits. And so I don't mean friends with benefits in the way that people might typically associate this, right? If I said this to my students, friends with benefits, they have a very, very different notion of what it is that I'm describing here. But what this research shows us is that, one, people who voluntarily associate with Black folks and with people of color outside of work tend to experience better relationships in the workplace, and that ultimately pays long-term dividends for them in terms of their career prospects, because one of the things that fuels your ascendancy in modern organizations is your ability to relate effectively across difference. Another way in which having these friendships with minorities and Black folks in particular can prove beneficial is that you tend to learn more from things like diversity training and diversity educational initiatives. So you benefit more from these things focused on learning about difference because you have already made openness to difference and dissimilarity a part of who you are. I also read a study that came out about 6 years ago that was looking at this whole process of contagion, right? So we've talked a lot in the literature about emotional contagion, but what they found is that discrimination and prejudice and bias is also contagious. And on the one hand, that's really bad, right? Because it means that racists are out there spreading the racist gospel and other people are buying into that. But it also means that people who are out there spreading the equality and the egalitarian gospel are also having similar effects, because what they found is it's not just the bad stuff that spreads and is contagious, but it's also the good stuff, right? So when you find people who are out there living their lives in this way that promotes egalitarianism, know that that's likely going to be infectious. And if you want to see that change, then you can start by being that change. A lot of the work that I've done is also looked at diversity climates, which is essentially this notion of how inclusive is an environment? How much does this environment support the provision of equal employment opportunity? And what we have found is that diversity climates and climates for inclusion are beneficial in a number of important ways, but one of the most significant is that these demographic differences that we oftentimes see in terms of performance and in terms of behaviors disappear when the organizational climate supports diversity, right? So we don't see white employees outperforming Black employees, or we don't see differences in absenteeism where Black folks are more likely to be absent than white employees if the diversity climate is more hospitable. We also see some evidence of emerging success strategies, so things like public accountability and pressure, where people are paying attention and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, we see something that doesn't look quite right. It looks like you're discriminating over there, is actually having an impact on the things that organizations are doing, right? Organizations don't like being called under the carpet. They feel like they might stand to lose something. And so when you are exerting this public pressure, either through the way that you spend your dollars or through the things that we write or we say about organizations, it can have an impact on the way in which they actually go about managing their processes. And then this really cool study that just came out looks at priming, whereby if we're going through a selection system decision, right, we're sitting down and we're trying to figure out who's the best candidate. One of the things that we often do is we try not to pay attention to difference. We try not to look at race and not to look at gender. And when we try and suppress those things, sometimes the opposite actually happens, right? We overreact to them. And what they found is that through this process of priming, where we tell people, hey, identify the best Black candidate in this pool, identify the best white candidate in this pool. What they found is that the decisions that people arrived at actually involved less bias and didn't compromise quality in the process, right? So this notion of, hey, you can either be diverse or you can be a high-performing organization, it just shows the fallacy in that thinking. So what to make of all of this? I pulled out this quote from Hattie McDaniel because when I was a kid, people used to say this all the time, and now nobody ever says it, talking about this whole notion of being a credit to the race. And I want to end on that as I attempt to wrap things up right here. The first thing is, it's important for us to realize that historical legacies have enduring consequences. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of this mess overnight. And things that happened in the past definitely have implications for where we are now, right? So change doesn't just happen. Change happens because people invest in making change happen. And when people don't invest, change doesn't happen. One of the really simple ways in which the past is still influencing us now is people look at things that they've seen, or they look at history, and then they develop their expectations about what's possible, and then that either facilitates or limits their progress. So I can remember being told by an elementary school teacher that I could never be president, and her explanation for this was there had never been a Black president, right? So that's the past dictating her expectations of what's possible for me, which she then tried to pass along to me. And so now I'm looking at this thing going, oh my gosh, I guess I can't do this, right? So we have to be really, really careful about how we let the past continually imprison us. We also have to realize that even though a lot of the literature out there suggests these negative effects associated with being a Black employee, it's not all negative. There are a lot of positive things, and people are now starting to really build on that literature. So one of the things that I find particularly encouraging is a lot of times the bias that we see tends to be moderated by performance, right? And so when we perform really well, as Bill Parcells, the legendary football coach, has been, want to say, success is the ultimate deodorant, right? And so it can clean up a lot of things. And when people perform really well, one of the things that I found in my research is that customers who might otherwise discriminate now aren't so interested in discriminating, right? Because what they're really interested in is getting that really high quality good or service. There's also a developing literature about ways in which you can use your stigma or the biases that people may have against you to your advantage, right? So if we know that people are looking at our skin color and are assuming that we are not going to be very good at something, and then we can show them evidence to the contrary, there's this theoretical paradigm that occurs when people get surprised in that way, where they tend to overreact. And now they look at us like, oh my God, you're a unicorn of some sort. Right? And there are benefits that tend to, accompany that expectancy violation that occurs when people think that we're not going to be all that great, and then they see, oh, you're actually good, right? So yes, race can be stigmatizing. Yes, that can coincide with a lot of negative things, but it can also be transcended in ways that you can actually take that negative and make it a positive. And ultimately, I want to end on this identity dilemma, where one of the pressures that I've dealt with my entire career is knowing that if I mess up, there may not be another Black person who comes behind me, because I've been the first Black person to do a whole lot of stuff, or the first Black man to do this. And that puts a lot of pressure on you. And to all of the Black folks out there listening to this, we got to be really, really careful how much of that we internalize. Yes, it is true that our mistakes are oftentimes generalized in ways that work that way, but we can actually be our own worst proponents if we internalize too much of that, because then it makes it really impossible for us to live up to our potential. Right? And so, yes, we do want to be credits to our race. Yes, we do want to make sure that we're not, as Vice President Kamala Harris recently said, she said, I may be the first woman to sit in this seat, but I won't be the last. Right? And so a lot of us feel like I may be the first Black person or the first Black male or the first Black woman to be in this position, but I don't want to be the last. Yes, we want to hold a high standard, but have some grace for yourself in realizing that you're not carrying every Black person on your back every time you go out there trying to be successful. So with that said, I will land the plane there and look very much forward to having this conversation about being Black in the workplace. Stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Avery. That was a very enlightening and thought-provoking discussion. And I know that a lot of people sent some questions before the talk, so I'm going to read some of that. For those who've joined us after the presentation, the introduction, please, you could jot a few questions in the Q&A section, and then we could start looking at these questions and share them with Dr. Avery. I wanted to show you also that in the chat, I just added a link to CAAS events. So today was the first event of the center. We're going to have more. So thank you for joining us today. And we hope you will come back for the reminder of the events of the semester. So in fact, Dr. Avery, one of the questions, it wasn't really a question, but someone asked some advice to communicate fatigue. And I think that your last comment is all about that. And someone else was also asking, how can I best support my Black colleagues without putting burden on them? So I think those two questions are kind of related. And I would like you to give some, advice about, this notion of how to talk about fatigue and how to support people, because we need to be in good shape to do what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's one that doesn't have an easy answer, unfortunately. My co-author Enrica Ruggs and I wrote a piece recently where we used a metaphor of a death in the family to talk about this whole notion of what it's like in responding to these mega threats, like the killing of George Floyd on national TV being broadcast again and again and again when you're Black, as opposed to when you're not. And part of what we described in that, when we tried to lay out, sort of a formula for success here, is that there needs to be grace on both sides, right? So when you're Black and you're going through it and you're feeling the trauma that's associated with, these types of events, it's very easy to lash out at people who don't formulate their questions or try and express, their support in the quote unquote right way, right? The ideal way. And there is no ideal that works across everybody. So part of it is just understanding that this is a highly nuanced process, right? Because there is trauma involved. There is grief often involved. And so for Black folks who are going through it, we need to extend some degree of grace to, the white folks who are attempting to support us through that, who are attempting to be allies, who are attempting to advocate, and realize that they might not say everything just the right way. But then there also needs to be this grace on the other side in recognizing that you're going through something traumatic. And this really hurts, right? To be reminded that this thing that you can't control has such a significant impact on your life and the life prospects of the people around you. Right. So I think that for both sides to just attempt to empathize and to have a greater appreciation for the struggles that people on both sides are experiencing. I mean, I was talking to some of my white colleagues in the past year who said, look, some of this is hitting me for the first time. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I wrap my mind around this? And I'm wanting to talk to people. And, my Black friends are all saying, you need to go out, you need to, take this on yourself. And so I have actually started saying to more, Black folks, I'm like, look, okay, we got to help folks to help us. But I also say to my white colleagues, hey, understand that people grieve differently, right? And if somebody lashes out, it's not you that they're lashing out at, right? Understand that they're having a bad day, or that they're having a negative or adverse reaction, to how they might be feeling right now. So I just think that empathy, that grace on both sides is such a critical part of it.
Thank you. So Kathy Fletcher has a question. So here's the question, and I think it's kind of related to some of your comments. What research or other findings can you share about the most important strategies for creating those safe spaces that counteract those biased differential outcomes in the workplace?
So there's still very much ongoing accumulation of empirical evidence as to what is best practice there. I would say, to me, if you're going to focus on one thing, the one thing is leadership, right? Really, really important is, what do your leaders say and what do your leaders do with respect to difference? all too often leaders want to abdicate their responsibility for managing diversity to someone else, right? Like I've even had CEOs within the last year reach out to me wanting me to write and craft their messages that would then be relayed to their employees and to their external stakeholders. And I said, no, that needs to come from you. And they would say, well, I feel unprepared, to make these statements. And I'm like, good, then you need to get prepared, right? Go out, acknowledge that you have not been prepared, that you have not done the due diligence and, invested the time and effort and energy to understanding these things in the past, but you're doing it now, right? So having leadership go on record and being explicit about what we value as an organization and what I value as an individual and what we expect for people with respect to, the code of conduct and, what happens to folks who violate that, and then being consistent in ensuring that, people who violate that are dealt with in a way that, discourages and sends the signals to everybody that this is not okay here. I think that is probably the area in which I would invest the most time and energy and effort. So if you are a leader, realize that you're the biggest model for what appropriate behavior looks like in your organization.
Thank you. So Zara Jamal has a question too. What are your thoughts on the value of race-based ERGs in corporate Americas? Do they exacerbate systematic racism, or have they been used successfully to address it?
I think if you ask any organizational psychologist or any organizational professor a question like that, you're going to get the same answer, which is it depends. And so then the key question is, what does it depend on? And in organizational settings, the usefulness of an ERG is really contingent upon the infrastructure that surrounds it. So does the ERG have an immediate connection to leadership? If it doesn't, then it's not worth a whole lot of time, right? Is there a charge that is clear for that ERG, or is it just a space where people get together and gripe about, the shared experience of X? To the extent that they have a clear charge, to the extent that that charge then fits into the larger overarching organizational strategy, to the extent that they are plugged in and networked with leadership so that they have the ear of folks who are making these organizational decisions, then ERGs can be very effective. David Thomas wrote an article in Harvard Business Review probably about 15 or 16 years ago, where he detailed how IBM successfully used employee network groups, as they were calling them prior to them being referred to as ERGs, in a very strategic way that then facilitated them being impactful for improving the experiences of their marginalized employees.
Thanks. So I think we have a question for a Rice undergrad. This was sent earlier. So what advice do you have for Rice undergrads who may be joining the workforce soon? Okay,
I will give a multi-pronged answer to that. If you are an individual, if you are a Rice undergraduate of color, I think that the biggest thing that you can focus on is figuring out the rules of the game wherever it is that you find yourself, because the rules are not always consistent. And well-intentioned people will give you advice that they hope will generalize well, right? So that's the whole purpose of education by and large, right? Is to give us these principles and tenets and theories that we can then generalize across settings. But one of the first things that you will figure out when you get out into the workplace is everything that you've been taught doesn't generalize. And so your job is, while you're in school, to learn how to think, to learn how to research, to learn how to process information and make decisions on the fly, so that when you get out there, you realize that the learning isn't over just because I graduated and left the classroom, right? I'm just now learning in a different context. And so now you've got to figure out, what is it that my boss values? What is it that my colleagues value, right? And then it becomes a game of sorts, right? So it's impression management on steroids, where you're trying to figure out, how do I emphasize the things about me that present and add value within this space? And how do I minimize and downplay and ultimately address the things that are shortcomings or that are weaknesses, within this space, right? For those who are in the majority group, I would say go out and be champions. Go out and be bold. Go out and be brave. And it does require bravery to be an ally. It absolutely requires bravery. One of the things that I think that we have been really disingenuous about in the way in which we talk about social progress within this country is we downplay the potential consequences of being associated with marginalized groups in the context of being an ally. There are considerable costs, which is why it does require bravery. It does require bold to challenge something that you see that's not right. But we've got to do it anyway, even if it's uncomfortable, even if, it creates some sense of cognitive dissonance where it's like, oh, is it going to be okay if I do that, right? So I point to the legacy of people like John Lewis, who have stepped out into place after place after place that's uncomfortable, right? And there are many other people that I could point to, so I don't want to, give an overly long answer to the question, but I just think it's such an important one, because if we don't start to model some of the things that we really want to see with respect to greater equality and greater advocacy for folks who have been oppressed and continue to be marginalized, then we can't just expect that to happen.
And I think the next question is kind of echoing this point, but from maybe the perspective of the faculty or the administration. What can the university do to better prepare their Black students for the corporate world?
Tell them the truth. And I mean that in a number of different ways. I had faculty who were a part of my intellectual development who really, really wanted well for me, but were afraid to tell me the truth. And sometimes they were afraid to tell me the truth because they thought that if they criticized me, I would think that they were racist. That's not helpful, right? It did not make me better that they were afraid to levy legitimate criticisms of my work. I actively sought out people who I knew would tell me the truth and be critical where I needed to have that criticism. So that's one truth. Another truth is don't tell them these things that we have perpetuated over and over again to make ourselves feel good about meritocracy. There is no meritocracy, right? That's not to say that merit doesn't matter, but there is no meritocracy that anyone will find where you go into an organization and you are judged strictly on the basis of what you bring to the table. It just isn't real. And so we need to stop telling people that. We need to prepare them for the world as it is instead of trying to prepare them for the world as we wish it was.
Thanks. And I think maybe this might be the last question. And those are still the questions set in advance. It's a question that I really find important because I've been in some of these and I always roll my eyes when I attended. Can a diversity or unconscious bias training ever be done well in an organization? What would make an effective training? And I have to say, I've been to 3 or 4 of those, and I never understood why I was there. Because literally, whatever people were discussing, I'm like, and when hearing your colleagues say things which are totally biased, and sometimes right down, sexist and racist, in a space supposed to unravel all of that. And I'm like, I can't. So maybe you have some answers.
So the biggest reason that diversity training is oftentimes so unfulfilling for the folks who participate in it is because it is not a part of the larger overarching strategy that the organization is engaged in. And I'll give a quick story as a for instance. So last year when everything's really hitting the fan, a lot of folks in corporate reached out to me and said, hey, you've been studying this stuff for a long time. Can you help us deal with this? And one of the things that I realized is that people really underestimate the depth of the problem. I would kind of get, and joking a little bit here, but right, people would basically call and they were like, okay, can you help us solve this, systemic racism thing, before the fourth quarter? And I'm like, it's July. What? You think we're going to solve racism in 6 months? Yeah, that's not the way any of this works. But when you underestimate the depth of the problem, it's really easy to see how you would come up with a slapstick solution, right? So you come in and you say, okay, we've got one answer to every diversity problem that we may be experiencing, and that's diversity training. And the way in which we're going to utilize this diversity training is we're going to go out and pay somebody who doesn't necessarily have, the credentials, or who doesn't necessarily have the background, or who hasn't been able to show the empirical evidence, right? And so there are all of these reasons why this shouldn't work. And then it doesn't, and it's like, oh, diversity training is bad. And it's not that diversity training is bad. It's that diversity training has to be a small piece of a much larger, coherent puzzle, right? Like the best way that I can really hammer this home is, imagine that you're an organization and the average person that you hire is 25 years old. So when you hire that person, they come in with 25 years of baggage, 25 years of counter programming. And you really think the 2-hour diversity training, seminar is going to undo the 25 years of counter programming that they've had up to that point? Of course not. And even if you were successful, let's say, oh my God, you came up with something revolutionary, and in 2 hours you were able to undo 25 years. Well, guess what? When they go back home that day, they plug right back into the machine. All of the negative programming is there. All of the negative images, all of the stereotypical images, all of the reinforcing of that, all of the political stuff that's out there, all of that provides these cloudy pictures and reinforces these stereotypical notions, the machine doesn't stop. And so we can't stop either. These one-offs will never be effective. But it doesn't mean that they can't be a part of a larger, more comprehensive strategy that will be effective.
Thank you so much. Ooh, I think there's one last question, if we may. Kimberly G, along the line of telling the truth, can you talk about the problem of the minority group broaching the topic of diversity with their leadership, who are often members of majority groups, without damaging their own reputation or position, in the company politically? Any suggestion of how to do that? Sorry, heavy question. This will be the last one, but I think it's an interesting one.
Save the easy one for last, right? No, as someone who has spent some time in a chief diversity officer type role, it's a really good question, and it's one where there are no easy answers. So there are at least 2 studies of, that are in the empirical literature that I know of that show that your credibility does take a hit if you are a member of an oppressed group and you are advocating on behalf of equality, because people perceive it as being largely self-interest. Now, I don't know that there is a good way around that, and I don't know that we need to necessarily spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out a way around that. The reality is that all of the evidence supports the fact that diversity climates tend to raise all boats, right? This is a higher tide initiative that raises all boats. There is no backside. There is no drawback to promoting a climate where everyone feels that they can, succeed. And so I don't think that we need to apologize for that. I don't think that we need to try and figure out some means of not advocating for equality. I think that we just need to be clearer about what it is that we mean by equality, right? Because there is a tendency to view this as zero sum, where if we are advocating on behalf of people that have traditionally been marginalized and oppressed, then the perception is that we are somehow advocating for more for this group and less for this group, when at the end of the day, equality benefits everybody, because what it does is it rewards performance, it rewards competence. And so when we go in and we advocate for diversity, we need to be clear that we're not advocating for handouts. We're not advocating for set-asides. We're not advocating for giving something that is undeserved. We're advocating for giving something that is very much deserved, right? We're advocating for providing true equal employment opportunity. We're advocating for leveling the playing field so that everybody can thrive and can live up to their potential. And at the end of the day, what that ultimately looks like from the organization standpoint is greater success, greater productivity.
Thank you so much. Laura Gallier is telling you this is an outstanding presentation. Thank you so much. And I think, thanks for coming here, sharing your expertise, but as you announced at the beginning, giving us hope too, because those are not easy topics, but you still find a way to show us that we can support each other. It's not going to be easy, but there are ways to do it. And I think you brought back the humanness or humanity into the system, into the organization. And I'm really thankful for your presentation today, Dr. Avery. And for those, before you leave us, please, there's the link I put in the chat so that when we have all the list of events for, I think I'm trying to do it again, but it's not working this time. The list of events for the center, but you could also go on our website for caaas.rice.edu/events, and then you will see the list of events. Thank you again for joining us today. It was really our pleasure to have you with us. And I'm trying to type, yay, here it is. So go on the chat, you will see the link, and then please register for more events. I'm sure they will be as excited as the one Dr. Avery did for us today.